There's also different types of ontological argument. They're originally put forward by Anselm. So that argument is phrased in lots of different ways, even this argument itself, but it's something along the lines of God is, by definition, a thing than which none greater can be conceived, right? And then the idea is that so you want to say something like God, one way of cashing this out is that God has all great making properties to their maximal extent, right? So knowing stuff is great making, and if you're something greater than which nothing can be conceived, then you don't just know certain things and are ignorant of others, but you know everything, right? That seems to be the maximal extent of that property of knowledge, is knowing everything, right? So this maximal being has maximal knowledge, and the same with power. If you can do some things but not others, then you're not a maximal being. You have to be able to do everything. Blah blah blah, right? So we get through these list of properties that we could think of as a perfectly great being would have to have, and then the idea is, well, if this being that we've just been talking about, if that was just something that was in our minds, if it was just an idea of a thing that didn't actually exist, then it would be lacking in a great making property, right, which is existing. So it would have to actually exist as well. It couldn't just be a potential being or a conceptual being or something, an idea of something. It'd have to actually exist. And then it seems to be that the idea of the perfect maximal being has to exist, right? That it has to be part of its definition that this thing actually exists. And because we can entertain the idea in our minds, that means that this thing that we're entertaining when we think about it actually does exist. And so even the fool who says within his heart that there is no God or something, when he's saying that there is no God, the thing that he's saying about is God. And if he knew what he was saying properly when he said that, he'd be saying that there is no maximal perfect being. But a maximal perfect being has to exist. Therefore, God does in fact exist, right? That seems to be, do you want to, does that sound right to you, the way that you've heard the argument made before?
Yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah.
Okay, so, and then obviously there are lots of different versions of this. Plantinga's resurrected it in a contemporary setting. Kant and Russell's put forward this argument against this. I think Kant does as well, against Anselm's version of the argument, which is that essentially existing isn't really a property, right? It's not like knowing stuff. You can be in. If I know that this is a mug or something, that it seems like that's a genuine property that I have. And then saying that I don't know that this is a mug or something is like me not having that property. So it seems like the knowledge of that thing being a mug is a property that I either have or don't have, and that makes sense. But when it comes to existence, the idea is something like, if you say this mug exists, you're not really adding a property onto it, right? Because if I say this mug doesn't exist, then as we were talking about before, with this is kind of going back right to the beginning of it, it's a negative existential. It doesn't really seem like what I've said makes any sense, right? This mug doesn't exist. Well, if that's true, then there isn't any mug, right? So then what does this mug mean at the beginning of the sentence? So it almost doesn't, it's almost a contradiction in terms to say of something that doesn't exist. But if that's true, then to say of something that it does exist is a tautology, right? It's just an empty truism. And if that's right, then existing isn't a property like other properties, like being half full of coffee or something, right? That is certainly not a contradiction to say that it's not half full of coffee, and it's not a tautology to say that it is, right? It seems like a substantial truth. So if that's right, then the property of existence is very different from these other types of properties. And to the extent that it isn't really a property at all, right? It's just, it's just another way of saying something like there is a mug. Right? If you say there is a mug and there is an existing mug, you've just said the same thing twice, right? You haven't added a thing on by saying there is an existing mug. Whereas if I say there is a mug and there is a red mug, then the second one is adding more information in. But the first could be sort of plausibly construed as just being the same thing, like saying there's a mug and there's an existing mug. And if that's right, then existence isn't really a property. And if it isn't really a property, then it's also not a great-making property.
So
and if that's right, then it doesn't work in the argument.
In the way Plantinga casts the argument in modal logic, doesn't he still assume that existence is a property and great-making property? And then he says, well, if a maximally great being exists in some possible world, it must exist in every possible world.
Yeah. Okay, so Plantinga's argument is quite different.
Well, real quick, just to like end on, I mean, not to end, but just to comment on St. Anselm's. So would you say that since it doesn't necessarily make sense to say existing is a great making property, it resorts to just being a sort of unjustified assertion? He's just saying God exists, therefore God exists?
I'm not sure if it comes down to that. But what it's doing is it's saying, so what it's challenging is that there's this idea that, well, with some properties, that properties can be split into great making and not great making. So being lazy isn't a great making property. And that's why we're not going to say that God is maximally lazy, right? He's not in any sense lazy because it's not a great making property. So we'll put laziness into this pile over here, but then we'll put, generous. Plausibly being maximally generous, let's say, is great making. Although, to be honest, I just don't find that plausible because, as I was talking about before with the poles of vice and virtue, it just doesn't seem right that being maximally charitable is a great making property. Let's pick a different one. All knowing, right? That does seem like plausibly it's better to be more knowing than less knowing or something. So knowing everything makes you greater than knowing fewer things. So let's put that knowing things, or the property of knowing X or something, in the other pile from lazy. So that's in the great making property. And then when it comes around to existing, you want to ask, which pile does this property go into? The response is that it doesn't really go into either pile because it's not a property at all. The question of whether it's a great making property or not doesn't apply to this thing, right? It's just a kind of turn of phrase that doesn't actually indicate the possession of a property by any object, right? It looks like it does on the surface, like grammatically. You want to say, I could say James is male and James is existing, or something. Like structurally, they look like the word existing and male playing a similar role in the sentence. But when you run through the considerations I was just outlining before, they actually operate very differently. It seems like, conceptually speaking, existence plays a completely different role to other types of properties. So it's not that saying that God exists, therefore God. I don't see how it boils down to that, but it does mean that the jump from saying that there's a maximal being or something, perfect being, plausibly has to have all of these properties, like he's plausibly all-knowing, but not, and plausibly not lazy. But then it blocks the jump from, well, he plausibly exists then, because existence is a great making property. It sort of stops the argument there and says no. So basically what it's saying is, you can define a great being if you want, but that doesn't mean that that thing exists. It's still a kind of something like an empirical matter or a synthetic claim, not an analytic claim. It doesn't follow from the meaning of your entity that it exists. However you define an entity, it still has to be a fact or not about whether it exists. It can't follow just from the meaning. So it's like you can't just define it into existence or something. Right? It doesn't follow just from the definition of something that it exists.